can an army be broken? What does that even mean? And what's the difference between an army breaking or an army being defeated? Are those the same things? And what are the implications of both? Especially with the war in Ukraine right now, those are some really important questions that need to be asked. And in fact, hardly anybody's even looking at that. There's some assumptions that are out there that may not be as well founded as people believe. Now, in today's episode, we have somebody who's going to basically the subject matter expert on this topic, and we're going to be talking to Dr. Michael Vlajos who's really, he's actually just written something on this, and we're going to get to that shortly. But welcome, Dr. Vlahos. Glad to have you on the show.
Thanks, Colonel. It's a real joy to be here.
Well, before we get into this, I want to make sure people understand, you know who we're talking to here, because man, your credibility is just off the charts here. Dr. Vlahos once headed the Center for the Study of Foreign Affairs at the U.S. State Department. Previously, he served as the director of Security Studies program at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He was also formerly a senior staff member of the National Security Assessment Team at the National Security Analysis Department at Johns Hopkins Advanced Applied Physics Laboratory. He's also widely published, has written several books, and he actually got his undergraduate degree from Yale in 1973 and his PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in 1981. Welcome to the show again, and man, that's a lot of credibility you got there.
Well, I mean, I've made a lot of enemies along the way, so credibility is really in the eye of the social world that you inhabit. So,
well, if you don't have any enemies, then you're probably not doing something right, or because especially if you're trying to tell the truth on something that's not popular and people don't believe, then yeah, you're going to have some enemies. So that's what we need more of. We need more truth. And I respect people like you who really aren't concerned about the personal costs. You just put the truth out there, and then people can either accept it or they can't.
Yes, and you have to somehow deal with the punishment they mete out to you. So yes,
that's the unfortunate part, and that's why I respect you and a lot of people like you who do that, because it's no kidding. There's a cost to pay for some of this stuff, but man, it is so needed, and I'm so grateful that you've come on our show today to talk about this.
Well, it's always worth it, because in the end, no matter what happens to you in the social realm, you can at least live with yourself. And part of the wonderment that I face every day living in the Imperial City is that people are so willing to divest themselves of their integrity. And I wonder how they can do that, because in the end, you have to reflect on what you've lost in the process.
Well, and I think especially in terms of this war between Russia and Ukraine, there's quite a lot of that goes on. Some of we cover here in previous episodes of Deep Dive. And I do sometimes wonder, what are these guys like when the camera turns off and they say things that are self-evidently untrue? And when people are dying in Ukraine because of a lot of this, and we're going to that's going to actually lead into what we're going to talk about here in a second. But I do wonder, what are they like when the lights are turned off and they go to bed at night and it's just them and their conscience in there? I wonder how they deal with some of that. But
I've been wondering that ever since the so-called global war on terror, because at that time, as you well recall, there were lots of general officers and flag officers who were part of this Bush administration effort to get the correct word out, and they were called message force multipliers. And I'd see them in the green room before doing, say, a little TV interview, and they were quite happy to dissemble in front of the camera. And I think a lot of them are part of a culture now in the U.S. military, in which those who make it, and who make flag, as they say, are ushered into a world of double dipping. They have wonderful retirement and pension, but at the same time, they have 6 or 7 figure jobs awaiting them in the defense industry. And they get sucked into a certain kind of lifestyle. And I think they feel that they're fulfilling some kind of higher level raison d'etre of being in a high ether elite level. And so they're able to console themselves uh, because they're making so much money. And
Yeah,
they're
and and certainly
it's
when you get up to that level, there's no joke. They are received well, and they do get rewarded for this. As you're getting rewarded for telling the truth of having the negative side, they get rewarded on the other side when they play along with that. But
yes.
as we talk about here, there's some real consequences to that, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about right here, because the biggest bill payer for a lot of this dishonesty, and you just got to call it what it is, about the people saying things about this Russia-Ukraine war to keep it going, are the Ukrainian, slip of the tongue there, are the Ukrainian soldiers and the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian future. Yes. I mean, all of that's going in there. And that leads directly into here. You just published a piece in August in Compact Magazine on the issue of breaking of the armies. And that's a term that a lot of people don't hear. They hear winning and losing, but they don't really know what that means. And I want to read something that you wrote in there, a little excerpt, and get you to elaborate a little bit. You wrote, "A defeated army and a broken one are two different things. An army merely defeated in battle can often make successful withdrawals, reform itself, and reconstitute its strength, as Rome did after its humiliation at Cannae, eventually destroying its great rival, Carthage. But when whole armies break, when they lose their will to fight, the whole nation can likewise break. That is what happened to the great empires in World War I. It is also the fate awaiting the Ukrainian army." Now, that's an interesting concept, because you say that almost like it's going to happen and not like that it could happen. And I wonder where your confidence from that lies. But also, actually, before that, just explain to us, what does it mean for an army to break? Because if you see that Ukraine, for example, has mobilized, hundreds of thousands of people even this year. So there's some number, I don't know, 500,000-600,000, who knows the real number, in the army right now. So one would think, well, they can keep fighting almost indefinitely as long as they keep mobilizing people. But you suggest that might not be the case.
There's a deeper dynamic going on when an army breaks. In other words, the sign that it is about to break or coming apart are the manifestations. They may start as symptoms, and then they will be manifestations of what is actually going on inside. And so what we're talking about when an army breaks is not, oh, well, this unit mutinied, or that unit deserted, or several units have decided to march on the capital. All of those things are manifestations of an army breaking. But it is the loss of the army's collective will on the part of individual soldiers to continue to fight for an authority, a ruling class or monarch, or in an elected government, the Republican constitutional order itself, because they've lost faith in that order, and they have come to feel betrayed by the authority that has brought them into an impossible situation. In other words, the agency that took them to war, that required that they put their lives at risk and sacrifice themselves for that ruling authority, is broken by the failure of the authority to maintain leadership. And part of that, of course, is defeat, but part of that is a sense, literally, that the ruling authority has somehow betrayed the very ideals to which the people, the soldiery, the army itself subscribed and were willing.
Now that's an interesting issue, and because there seems to be almost competing forces at play on the Ukrainians in this situation, and I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on how you see this dynamic playing out. Because on the one hand, you can say, okay, nobody, and I have my own direct experience of being on the ground in combat and knowing what's being said at the national level and what they're claiming on television, and I'm living it on the ground, so I know what's going on, so I'm not deceived at all. So there's that dynamic there. And when, especially early in the war, when Zelensky was standing up and everybody was talking about how he was the next Churchill and all this, there genuinely were large numbers of volunteers in Ukraine, people showing up to mobilize themselves. They didn't even have to get summonses. That has kind of petered out over time. But so on the ground, especially in this current offensive, there has to be, most of these troops have to know that what they're claiming, that, oh, we're still succeeding, we're still moving forward. It's just not as fast as it should be. They know that it's almost suicide to go in there. But at the same time, there is an invading army in their land. They do have a significant hatred for Russia. And so even if they know that their government is lying to them, they still, would seem to have a real hard time of not wanting to fight or not resisting, because that's the enemy in there. So how do those two almost contradictory dynamics play out in terms of when an army could reach the breaking point?
There's a lot to unpack here. And I think we should start with the nature of the Ukrainian polity, of the country we call Ukraine. It's something of a schizophrenic or bipolar nation, in the sense that it has different inclinations of identity, different forces tugging and pulling at it. And if we look at Ukraine since its establishment as a fully independent state in 1991, you can see in election after election how split the nation was, predominantly between those who had their identity center in Ukrainian nationalism on one hand, and those who were more emotionally tied to Russia culturally, because they spoke Russian, and many of them were brought into Ukraine in the time of Stalin, but also a feeling that they were part of a greater Russian Commonwealth. And this is the split that has actually led to the war. And so, of course, the Russians did invade, but they invaded in many ways, and this goes back to 2014, to protect those most loyal Ukrainians, that is, loyal to Russia, those most inspired by their Russian connection, and to preserve them from being discriminated against and submerged in a kind of emerging pogrom. That was
it's funny we keep hearing Zelensky all the time talk about how they're going to reconquer all of Ukrainian territory, including the Donbass. I keep thinking, you realize there was an 8-year civil war that was fought, and that led into this one right here. That land doesn't want to be liberated by the western part of Ukraine. So there's that's going in there. I guess that's part of what you're talking about.
Well, part of what I'm talking about is you have a nation that is not powerfully unified, and as a counterpoint in my article, I refer to both the Nazi Germany obliquely, but more directly to the American Confederacy, because in the case of the Confederacy and the Third Reich, you had a very powerful unity among the people, and even more so, a kind of deep connection between the people and a leader. I mean, in the case of the South, it became Robert E. Lee, but with the Third Reich, of course, it was Herr Hitler. And that bond was based on a powerful collective sense of loyalty to the enterprise that was, say, the Third Reich or the Confederacy, and a feeling that it was win or lose, do or die. And in Ukraine, that energy emerged initially with the Russian invasion, simply because of the shock of Russia moving in. And there is a powerful Ukrainian nationalism, mostly based in those parts of Ukraine that hated the Soviet Union and resisted it and fought against it, as we've seen lately in the little brouhaha in Canada over a former SS soldier who was Ukrainian and fought for the Germans, and hundreds of thousands, in the millions of Ukrainians, did fight for the Third Reich. And so there is a continuity from times past in Ukraine today, and naturally that's been sharpened by the invasion. And what I think has happened is that Western Ukraine, the part that wants to speak Ukrainian and has a passionate vision of Ukrainian identity on one hand, is farther and farther away from those Eastern Ukrainians who speak Russian and who have suffered under the revolution that began in the Maidan and led to a kind of attempt at cultural ethnic cleansing by the Ukrainian state, and that ultimately has unraveled into this war. And everyone talks about it as being Russia's response to NATO enlargement, which to some degree it was, of course. But the main core of the war is rooted in this struggle over identity. Now, how does this relate to an army breaking? Well, you have a Ukrainian army that, under the initial shock of invasion, rallied. And of course, Russia quickly occupied the more Russian-oriented oblasts. It had taken Crimea in 2014, and then it added to it the currently occupied oblasts of Zaporizhia, Kherson, and of course the breakaway republics, quote unquote, of Donetsk and Luhansk. And all of those together were fairly quickly separated from Ukraine. So what was left was a more ardent, if you will, a more emotionally connected Ukraine that was eager to throw out the invader. And so you had a tremendous response on the part of Ukrainian men and women to a war effort. However, it has to be said that there is another current going on that works against a long-term Ukrainian successful struggle or resistance, and that is the built-in corruption in Ukraine. So you have an enormously corrupt establishment and regime. You have an oligarchic ruling class, and you have a terrible inequality of wealth and income. And so what exists in Ukraine below the surface are fractious dynamics that tend to work against unity under pressure, the kind of unity that you need in an existential struggle in war. And so there was this initial surge of commitment to the struggle. And yet over the course of time, and it's going to be not so long from now, 2 years, the Ukrainians have suffered so many losses for so little result. And at the same time, given the dynamics of the war that everyone can see, except for the NATO agitprop centers, the media, and as you said, the generals who are out there constantly as boosters or cheerleaders, pumping the belief that Ukrainian victory is still inevitable. Apart from all of those, most people who examine what's going on in Ukraine, of course that includes Ukrainians themselves, can see that the war is the obvious cliche would be to say not going well, but the fact is the war is unraveling at the seams for Ukraine.
Yeah, and Mike, I want to bring something up here and show our viewers, kind of show some graphically here, which kind of underscore that point. Since January the 1st, the New York Times published a map just today, actually, that shows the line of contact there. And of course, you have the Ukraine side on the left, and in the pink area on the right is the Russian-controlled areas. And you see along that line, you see some dark red spots and some dark blue spots. What those represent is the amount of territory that has changed hands in the direction of either Ukraine or Russia since January 1st. So you're talking now closing in on 9 full months. And that's the only amount of territory that has changed hands. Now, on the one hand, you look at that and you say, well, it's a stalemate. I mean, that's, by definition, almost a stalemate. But you see that Ukraine, well, first of all, Russia had at the first third or so of the year they had this long, slow grind into the Bakhmut meat grinder where there was large numbers of casualties, probably on both sides, but probably higher on the Ukraine side because of firepower disparity. And then you've had 4 months basically of the Ukraine offensive. And yet you see that there's hardly any change in any of that there. Now, the question comes is, can Ukraine continue to just bring more troops in and mobilize more people and keep, who knows what the real number is, somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 today. But how many of those losses that they've had to gain no ground, basically, and the lines just haven't changed. How long can they continue to perpetuate that? And then how does that lead to the potential for a breaking?
Colonel, your observations bring up another deep tension. You have the tension, obviously, between two Ukraines. You have the tension between the loyalty to the state and the corruption of the state. And there's lots more to talk about there.
Mm-hmm.
But the third tension that you bring up is the tension between apparent reality on the battlefield and the actual dynamics of the war. On the surface, as you pointed out, it looks like a stalemate, and people keep referring to World War I and the Western Front. And the Western Front seemed to grind on forever, and it seemed as though there would never be any kind of resolution either way in the war, either by the Germans or the Allied coalition. But the fact is that is deceiving. World War I eventually led to the breakdown of the German army. The German army broke, and it broke for good reason. And the Ukrainian army is in a very similar situation. And so, whereas the boosters and tub thumpers, the generals and media, the U.S. government talking about how, oh, well, we can look to, say, a Korea solution because this war stalemated and it will be a long war and neither side can gain an advantage and go on forever. And that is just not the case. That is not what is actually happening below the surface. So if it looks like a stalemate, that's because the line of contact has hardly changed, just as it was on the Western Front. But the war is not about an imaginary line on terrain. It's not about geography. It's really about the struggle between two societies locked in battle. And the Ukrainian society is being played out. And people talk about attrition warfare. Well, that's like saying something as though, well, I said it, so we all know what it means. Well, what does it really mean? What is attrition really all about? In the case of the Romans that I mentioned earlier, after Cannae, actually after 3 terrible battles in a row where they lost, over 150,000 men altogether in a small city-state. Well, but it wasn't that small. Rome was very populous. Central Italy was full of people, and they were committed. And Carthage, on the other hand, was a much smaller place and was at a great disadvantage in terms of raising armies and had to rely on mercenaries in order to have any kind of military capability. And Hannibal was able to package all that very powerfully, but there was an inequality in force and capability. And you see this in Ukraine. Ukraine is not the Ukraine that is being described by Western media. It's not a nation of over 40 million. It wasn't much more than 36 million when the war began because of outmigration and a low fertility, one of the lowest in the world. Well, the war only accelerated the outmigration, both to Russia and to the EU, and a Russian occupation of the 4 oblasts plus Crimea meant that essentially you had a nation of, say, 35, 36, maybe even 37 million being cut in half. A quarter went to Russia and Russian occupied territory. Another quarter went to Europe. And the result is you have a nation today that's not much more than 20 million. And that's the size of the Netherlands. just a little bit bigger than the Netherlands and somewhat smaller than Taiwan. So
Right.
it may look big.
So which kind of brings to the question of what would a breaking army look like? For example, it's again, we can't know for sure, but let's just use the number. There's 700,000 on the Ukraine side manning the line of contact and elsewhere, wherever they're at in the country. So it's reasonable to suggest, at least for the period of time coming up, maybe the rest of the year, that they can continue to forcibly mobilize enough men to keep pace with all the losses they had. So is it that all they got to do is make sure they have enough men in uniform so that they keep having people to send to the meat grinder? Or is it possible that as an organization that the army could, I don't know, break? And if so, what does that look like on the ground? How does it manifest?
It's a dynamic that you just addressed, meaning the army that is ardent, that goes to war, that's eager to fight and willing to sacrifice in a war like the war we've seen in Ukraine or like World War I, that initial tranche that goes to war is destroyed. And Ukraine has lost the entire highly motivated army it went to war with initially in 2022. Then it managed to raise the second army, and that army was expended in Bakhmut and
Now the offensive.
current counteroffensive.
Yeah.
But the counteroffensive is eating up a third army because most of the second army was gone by the time Ukraine got to the counteroffensive, because it had expended so many of its best units in Bakhmut. So what you have, looking at the population picture, is with 20 million people, half of them are pensioners. And of the remaining, say, 10 plus million, we have to look at the 2.5 million men that were available for mobilization. But 788,000 of them are between the ages of 45 and 55, and with a life expectancy of about 66 years in Ukraine, and the level of, say, alcohol consumption and other factors, you're not going to get the best people out of your 45 to 55 group. That's almost 800 people. So they're going to be less than effective, and they have no military training. Then you take the losses that Ukraine has suffered, which are much higher than even I had thought and mentioned in my article. It's been announced that there are 500,000 new disabled in Ukraine. That was announced a couple of days ago. Well, and
500,000 just disabled.
Yeah, added this year as disabled.
Oh, gracious.
And 80% are soldiers. So that means that the Ukraine has these living people who are veterans who can't go back to the battlefield. And the Soviets used to call those irrecoverable losses. In other words, if someone is disabled in battle and can't go back to fight, then that he's as good as dead from the standpoint of military command. And so
it's not just about those who have died in war, but it's those who are physically incapable of going back. So the irretrievable losses. So the number is much higher than just how many have been killed, which is probably pretty high by itself.
Well, the other factor is in Ukraine, and this has come out in lots of recent interviews that have been published in the West. Ukraine doesn't have any field hospitals. It does not have an infrastructure for urgent care. I mean, in the US, we have helicopters, we have the Golden Hour.
Yeah.
Men are plucked out from the battlefield instantly, and many of them survive. So the ratio in Iraq, for example, was something like 1 to 14 or 1 to 17. In other words, for every killed in action, 14 wounded men or 17 even would survive. Yeah. And that ratio in Ukraine is potentially as low as 1 to 1. That's worse than the Civil War over 150 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, World War I, it was 1 to 4. And if it's 1-to-1, and part of that too isn't just the lack of medical care once wounded have been brought back. It's the fact that so many of the wounded aren't being brought back, and they're bleeding out on the battlefield.
And so, how does that feed into the Ukrainian army broken? Because you made a declarative statement in that excerpt I wrote there that it's going to happen to the Ukraine. Why are you so confident it's going to happen, and how will we know it when it does happen?
Well, the fact is, so if you have 400,000 irrecoverable disabled veterans, and you have, that means you probably have about the same number of dead at this point, and that number of 400,000 plus has appeared in many places. I mean, there are different vectors in coming at that figure. So that, and then you have tens of thousands of missing, and you also have something like 18,000 prisoners of war. You add all that up, you're getting close to 1 million out of a population of 20.
I can't even imagine that number.
And it is, and then if you take the fact that the men you're going to be putting into battle are either, they're talking about 16-year-olds now going in the latest mobilization, and they're mobilizing women. But you're looking at, along with these older guys who are out of shape, and remember, 71% of young Americans today are ineligible for military service. And so you can imagine, with a country that is, in terms of healthcare and people taking care of themselves, is in much worse state than the US, you're going to have trouble getting the kind of human material there. And they don't have training, and they're being thrust into the battlefield. So here, the major factor in an army breaking is the fact that there is there's no good human material and enough of it to actually be led into battle. And add to that the fact that the leaders have all been killed. All the motivated non-commissioned officers and officers have died long ago. And this was one of the biggest problems with the Wehrmacht in World War II after the turn of the tide on the Eastern Front, is they had lost too many officers. They weren't in a position to lead. And if we add further the example of what happened to the German army, there's a real reason the German army broke in October of 1918. And that was that in order for the Germans to conduct their big offensive in March of 1918, when they had all the troops released from the Eastern Front as a result of Brest-Litovsk, They had lots of divisions, and they had a way to break through. They knew how to break through.
Stormtroopers, right?
Pardon me? Yeah, but also they had this guy, Breakthrough Müller, Dirk Burgmüller, they called him, had figured out how to do the correct artillery preparation, which combined with stormtrooper assault units could really punch through and then exploit the breakthrough. Well, what the German army did was they took all the best, most motivated men from all their divisions, and they created a stormtrooper assault echelon. And it was that echelon that broke through so magnificently in March, April, May, June of 1918. And it was expended. It was destroyed, much like the highly trained and highly motivated Ukrainian army that went to war in 2022. And when it was gone, what did you have in all of the other divisions in terms of your human material? An awful term, but you're looking at capabilities man by man. And these were demoralized guys who were only effective if they were stiffened by motivated, gung-ho types.
Okay, so let me ask you this: in terms of in the moment, from that March to say June period, where the stormtrooper tactics were working, and they actually had a number of penetrations, was there a belief at the time, either on the Allied side or on the German side, that, man, the war has turned, and now then the German side is actually going to win because they have these breakthroughs? Was there concern of that before it petered out? And that's, so let me ask that first, because that has a corollary potentially in this war.
Right. Well, I mean, the Germans broke through and were very close to taking Amiens. Had they taken Amiens, they would have been able to cut off the Gough's Fifth Army, and that would have blown the war apart. But here's the problem: they're stormtroopers on foot, and they got exhausted. They had to break through 4 or 5 Allied trench lines, and then they were on foot, and it wasn't possible for them to receive the kind of logistical support they needed to be able to secure the key objectives. And Amiens was the key objective, and it was necessary.
So in that situation, there was a legitimate military potential for that tactic to work,
right.
But they exhausted because they burned up all of their high quality men. And sure, they put other Germans in uniform, but they weren't that quality, so they couldn't maintain the pace. Is that right?
Right. So you contrast that with the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and the Ukrainian counteroffensive has achieved none of the breakthroughs of the Germans in 1918, and yet they have expended themselves to the same degree. So they've lost at least 75,000 men at this point. And
so when in the German situation there, you're talking about 1918. Are you suggesting that the manifestation of the break was that the German leadership realized that they're not going to be able to fight anymore, they can't win, so that's why they sought the armistice to end the war? Because I mean, they still physically had troops on the ground. Or how did you, when you say they broke, how do you define that?
They broke. I mean, they started leaving. They couldn't do it anymore. The army couldn't fight anymore, and it began to drift away. It was
physically not attack when they were told to, for example.
This happened also to the Russian army in World War I.
Yeah, right. I was thinking that.
In a focused situation, the Battle of Caporetto, it happened to the Italian army. It also happened to the French army. There it took the form of mutinies after the Great Verdun battle. And the winner, where this general, the worst kind of person, General Nivelle, said, let's go on the offensive. And all the French units just said, no, we're not going to do this. Now, here's where we get into what are known as indicators and warning, right? There have been increasing numbers of units, Ukrainian units, that have refused to go into a battle where they know they're going to be wiped out. You have had increasing numbers of men deserting. The Russians have provided a safe way to connect with Russian forces and then surrender, not being shot while they try to surrender. And that is leading to a drain. And there's also an enormous amount of resistance, passive and active resistance, against men being forcibly mobilized. And in Britain back in the 18th century with the Royal Navy, that was called impressment.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that is essentially what's happening in Ukraine now. Men are being taken by force and hunted down. And European states, to their eternal shame and discredit, are extraditing Ukrainian men back to Ukraine.
Oh, that's actually happening. I heard they were seeking it. I didn't know that it actually happened.
Well, I haven't seen reports of that happening. They've been notified, the men in Ukraine have been notified, and I'm not sure where that stands, but the fact remains
They're
that
trying to do it for sure. Yeah.
Well, it indicates that the society is at a fragile moment, a tipping point potentially. So if we add all of the factors that we've been talking about together, it's well known by everyone in Ukraine that the corruption of the Ukrainian elites during this war has taken the form of protecting young elite guys from being drafted.
Right. There's actually lots of traffic on the Ukrainian Telegram channels where they're talking about, hey, yeah, look, where's Danilov's kid? That's one of the senior members of the administration. And it's openly known that they're going off into all these rich places elsewhere in the world or in Europe, and they still don't send their kids up there, yet they're mobilizing people off the streets to do it in Ukraine. So the question is, here's the current plan, according to Zelensky, that they're going to keep trying to inch along in the Zaporizhia area, even when the weather turns bad, which is similar in some respects to the Stormtrooper case, because they're sending troops on the ground, not even in armored units, to try and penetrate into the Russian areas and advance that way. So the casualty per meter gained is extremely high.
Yeah.
But Zelensky says that he keeps going to all these capitals, like he just went to the UN General Assembly, as well as to the United States, Canada, and several other countries, saying, yeah, I want a bunch more stuff. I need more tanks, planes, artillery pieces, missiles, and everything else. We're going to mobilize another 200,000 people. So in the spring of 24, we're going to be able to launch another offensive. What do you say to that?
Well, let's put all the factors together, because you'd asked earlier about, when does an army break? And apart from the historical examples we see one unfolding in front of us now. So let's take all the factors. The first would be the widespread turning against the regime and the elites. In other words, people finally say that my son is not going to be sacrificed for losing war. Then you add to that the fact that Zelensky, following potentially in the footsteps of General Nivelle, is asking his army to continue flinging itself against the rock of Russian defenses for nothing, and to keep doing that to satisfy the West so that more aid and weapons will be forthcoming. But of course, there is another reason for Zelensky maintaining the offensive, just as there was for Nivelle and for the French leadership at that point in the war. They didn't want to give off the vibe that they couldn't keep fighting, that France was losing. And one of the real problems with calling off this offensive, fraudulent as it is at this point, is that you're basically signaling officially that we've shot our bolt, that our last best chance to turn advantage into victory is gone. And henceforth, we'll be on the defensive the same way, say, that Germany was across half of Russia, knowing that things would end up eventually in Berlin. And I think that feeling is very strong now among Ukrainians. And even more to the point, and this gets back to the somewhat misleading Nazi analogy. I mean, Ukrainians are very much attuned to the German World War II experience. And to them, they're seeing a kind of repeat, a kind of sequel to the Eastern Front in World War II. And we know this simply from visual evidence. Those leopards that were received by Ukraine were considered to be panzers. And there are many, many photographs of Western tanks with Iron Crosses, not the German Iron Cross of World War I, but the cross that was emblazoned on German vehicles in World War II. And so you see these telltale signs that once the reason for fighting is gone, once the feeling is that the war is lost, then things unravel. And this is what happened to the German army in World War I. At some point, it wasn't simply that all the good men were gone and that the rest were demoralized and unwilling to fight. It was also the fact that with all of these giant U.S. square divisions of Pershings willing to take casualties, just like it was in 1914, the U.S. Army was pounding away at the Germans, and it was the combination of the two. It was the relationship dynamics between fresh, strong, unstoppable American forces on one hand, and a demoralized German residual force that just thought, why are we fighting? The war is essentially over. And so I think what the Russians have done is extraordinarily canny, and it speaks to the underlying dynamics that are going on in attrition warfare. You want to orchestrate, if you're the winner. You want to orchestrate the attrition on the other side so that it develops into an emotional wave that essentially does the work for you.
Yeah.
And rather, see, the problem is, given the way that war has changed, and that change being revealed on the battlefield over the last year with drones and the all-seeing eye, and the capacity to hit individual troops with drones, for example, has made it very hard for Russia to really feel confident in conducting what people tend to call big aero offensive, something like what you would see in the battle for France, for example, with the panzers racing across northern France toward Dunkirk. That's not really a good model to follow because of the casualties you'll take.
Right. Yeah. I guess it's always possible, but the numbers is going to be. I just don't see anything happening.
It's possible.
Now, I did earlier, but it just doesn't look like it's going to come. Michael, in the amount of time we have left here, let me kind of put you on the spot a little bit. And from between now and the end of the year, do you think that the Ukraine side is going to continue to be able to, run its head into this brick wall and get new stuff from the West and actually launch a new offensive in the spring of 24? Or do you think that they're going to break before that? And if so, what is that going to look like in relation to how it did in 1918 with the Germans?
Well, that's a tough question, and I'm going to have to get out on a limb here, I think, because we all wonder how the end game will play out. And of course, many of us don't even understand that we're into an end game. But those of us who see, as we do, that the dynamics of the war have changed, will wonder how that plays out. And right now, what I see the Russians doing comes under that terrible cliche of shaping operations, in the sense that I feel the Russians want the Ukrainian army to be as hollowed out and as weak as possible before they enter into war termination operations. And there are a couple reasons for this. First of all, Russia doesn't want to reawaken the NATO giant.
That's a good point.
The early part of the war, there was lots of emotion, lots of arm waving by NATO, great desire to give Ukraine everything it wanted. And Russia doesn't want to go back to that. And it doesn't want to go back to a situation, especially with the US election coming up, where Mr. Biden can use a crisis of Ukraine coming apart to escalate in a way that would help him as a misdirection to sort of distract Americans from his own weaknesses.
Electoral challenges,
and essentially say, we have to rally around the flag, Ukraine is falling. So it's in Russia's interest to remain conservative and cautious, and to engage in operations that are most productive in continuing to attrit the Ukrainian army, and to continue to undercut Ukrainian morale by destroying their infrastructure. And enough of the electrical grid was destroyed from last year, apparently, that it seems as though shutting Ukraine down this winter is an accessible issue for Russia.
I've been reading lots of reports that a lot of the Russian telegram channels speculate that Russia has been building up a larger pool of missiles and rockets to do exactly that, but they're holding off until the weather starts to change to make it have its biggest impact. I guess we'll see. Well,
I think Russia, if it's cold enough winter, the last winter wasn't cold enough for Russia to do anything in terms of an offensive. The ground didn't get hard enough. But a winter offensive would preempt Ukraine from having the time to refresh itself. You remember how Gettysburg is always, brooded about as, the turning point in the war. But there were a lot of pluses from Gettysburg for the South. Lee was able to save Virginia from starvation by bringing back thousands of cattle and thousands of tons of flour. And at the same time, because of the attrition in the battle, he gained a year to rebuild the Army of Northern Virginia, an entire year where there were no battles in that theater to speak of. So the last thing Russia wants to do is to give Ukraine time to somehow get its act together. It's got to keep up the pressure. And I think the attacks on infrastructure are one way to do it, but also to keep enticing Ukrainian forces to expend themselves and to conduct local offensives that can, like up by the Oskil River currently, that can attrite Ukrainian forces.
Right.
And
But let's say that whatever Russia chooses to do and however it's going to do it, whether it's those things and some other tactical stuff, what does it look like if they're successful on the Ukrainian army? What does a break look like?
Well, a break is a lot like, in structural terms, what happened in 1918 to the German army. The Ukrainian army is so weak that Russia can actually move and does move adroitly or decisively to bring the war to a termination, which would mean gaining the remaining objectives it has in Novorossiya, primarily Odessa, but Nikolaev, but also potentially Kharkov as well, and bring the war to a point where the regime collapses. That would require things like mutinies in the army. It would require larger scale desertions, for example, and perhaps even domestic resistance to emerge in Kiev or elsewhere. So all of those things are increasingly possible. But Russia is in a position where it wants to have a plan, and of course it has announced a plan to end the war. Not a date, obviously, but there has to be a decisive.
Shoigu gave it one. He said the end of 2025 yesterday.
Yeah, I know, and that is not really relevant to the dynamics on the battlefield. My sense is that Ukraine is a lot closer to losing its capacity to effectively hold the line.
That's certainly what it feels like to me. And who knows, that comment by Shoigu could have been nothing more than a psychological play against that dynamic by saying, hey boys, we're looking to go long term. If you think this is going to be over short, we're not. We got all day long, and we're going to keep this up to make people lose heart because they don't know, can they go till 2025, I guess.
I mean, this is one of the reasons, again, there's yet another factor in keeping the fiction of the Ukrainian offensive going. And that is that as long as you're still fighting, you're not retreating. You know, as long as you're still trying to advance, you're not stepping back. And that's a real turning point in the mind. And so I think it's Ukraine is following a one day at a time strategy now. And that in itself is a token that they feel the end is approaching. It's not here yet, and they can hold it off one more day and maybe one more day, but that it itself is an indicator, an important indicator.
Yeah, it's in your mind and moving from the back to the closer to the front, I guess. And and I guess I said I was putting you on the spot. I mean, nobody can predict something that's in the human mind, but we do see more and more of the indicators, if I'm hearing you correctly, and that is more of a realistic possibility than really anybody in the West is aware of. And there's too many people that it's not even on the radar of possibilities. They literally think as long as we keep giving tanks and planes and artillery shells indefinitely, this could be a forever war. But
bought off on this idea of a stalemate, which is it's an illusion. It's something over the top of the ground, not something that's inside. And what I think a smart Russian strategy would be now is to continue the war just long enough so that political dynamics in Europe and the US reach a point where we're ready to cut Ukraine off. And you see the right-wing party in Germany is just making, going from strength to strength. So the more that goes on, the better it is for Russia, because it's less likely that there'll be a big NATO confrontation. But Russia can't wait too long, can't wait so long that Ukraine is able to get its act together, even partially, and then the West renews its commitment. And that you don't want either. So to my mind, that is a space between, say, December and sometime next spring.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see how all this plays out. But Mike, I sure appreciate you coming on our show and giving us a side of things that, man, this is the very, very definition of a deep dive, and we're very grateful for it. And we will definitely be watching as this plays out. And, if any of this starts to happen, we may have you back on so you can, tell us how this is playing out there. So thank you for showing up, and we will look forward to the next episode. But for now, that's it from Deep Dive. We'll see you later.